On the morning of June 4th, 1940-2, a thin layer of mist hung over the Pacific as 3 American dive bomber squadrons closed in on the Japanese fleet. No one knew that the next 30 minutes would completely rewrite the course of the Pacific War. The SBD Dauntless dive bomber, the aircraft the United States Navy called its precision strike weapon, sank for Japanese fleet carriers on this single day. The victory at Midway immortalized the Dauntless, but what the official documents never mentioned was what those 30 seconds of dive truly cost the men who performed it. The Navy told its pilots they were the most precise instrument of naval air power, and from the moment the Dauntless entered fleet service in 1940, this claim ran through every deployment and briefing. The Dauntless would deliver bombs onto enemy decks with surgical precision at angles and moments no other delivery method could replicate. The dive bombing attack, a steep controlled plunge from 15,000 feet to 20-500 feet in approximately 30 seconds, was presented in doctrine manuals as the pinnacle of precision aerial attack. The men who flew the Dauntless were trained to a standard the Navy said made them the world's most accurate bombing platform, and they weren't told this was an honor. They weren't told it justified the specific demands of the aircraft and the mission, and that the Dauntless would decide the war. The Navy was not wrong about what the aircraft could do in the hands of trained men at the right moment against the right target. The doctrine manuals did not describe with comparable precision what those 30 seconds of committed dive actually cost the men performing them, and what the 18 months of Pacific combat before Midway added to that cost, across the full arc of what flying a Dauntless in wartime meant. They did not describe the rear seat, where the radio man gunner sat facing backward, watching the fighter trying to kill him approach from the direction he could not fly away from. They did not describe the oxygen system that failed above 15,000 feet with the irregularity the maintenance logs recorded and the operational schedules never accommodated. They did not describe what happened to pilots who survived their aircraft's destruction over open ocean and spent hours or days in water whose temperature, currents, and inhabitants the doctrine manuals had never characterized as operationally relevant data. The precision was real, and the Dauntless decided the war, but the rest of it was also real, and it is the part that deserves to be told with the specificity it warrants. Start with the aircraft itself, because the Dauntless's specific physical character determined everything about what flying it in combat cost the men who did it. And because its character, even in 1940-2, was already that of a machine the Navy had committed to replacing. The Douglas SBD-3 Dauntless, the primary variant at Midway, was a 2- seat carrier -1-1- Biro cyclone radial engine, developing 1,000 horsepower. She had a wingspan of 40-1 feet 6 inches, and her maximum speed at altitude was 250 miles per hour, a figure that looked adequate in 1930-9, but increasingly inadequate against the combat environment of 1940-2. Her normal loaded weight was approximately 10,400 pounds, rising to 12,000 pounds with a full fuel load into 1,000-pound bomb and the centerline rack. Her service ceiling was 20-4,000 feet, and her range with a bomb load was approximately 770-3 miles. Her defensive armament was 2 fixed forward firing 50 caliber machine guns operated by the pilot, and 2 flexible 30 caliber machine guns on a twin mount in the rear cockpit operated by the rear seat man. The distinctive feature of the Dauntless was those perforated dive flaps, mounted fore and aft under the outer wing panels, which opened hydraulically when the pilots elected dive brakes and slowed the aircraft's descent during the attack, holding dive speed to approximately 270-5 miles per hour at bomb release. This gave the pilot time to hold his aim. Without them, a dive from 15,000 feet would have been impossible, as the aircraft would have accelerated past 400 miles per hour before reaching release altitude, producing targeting errors that negated the precision the attack was supposed to provide. With them, the pilot had approximately 20-40 5 to 30 seconds in the dive to hold his pip per on the target, adjust for wind in the target's movement, and release at the calculated release point. 20-5 to 30 seconds in a committed dive at 270-5 miles per hour, pointed directly at a target that was usually shooting back. The dive itself was the defining experience of Dauntless service, and the one the operational training manuals described with the most institutional thoroughness because it one the Navy had thought hardest about. The attack began with a roll into the dive from the push-over altitude, typically between 15,000 and 17,000 feet. The pilot rolled the aircraft inverted, pulled the nose down through the vertical, and recovered to a 70-degree angle maintained by reference to the bomb sight mounted on the forward cockpit coaming. At 70 degrees, the horizon was somewhere above the pilot's head, the sky was behind him, and the target was below and slightly ahead, growing in the sight as the distance closed at a rate faster than training had suggested. And that required a specific quality of calm that was not the absence of fear, but something that operated alongside it. The anti-minus aircraft fire from Japanese ships in 1940-2 and 1940-3 was specific in its characteristics and its effects. Japanese ships carried 20-5 mm anti-minus aircraft guns in multiple mounts, twin and triple configurations, putting a high volume of relatively small caliber rounds into the air around approaching aircraft. 20-5 mm round was not the weapon that produced catastrophic single-hit kills, but it was the weapon that perforated fuel tanks, severed control cables, shattered cockpit glass, and wounded pilots through the thin aluminum skin of the fuselage. At a rate that surviving Dauntless pilots described with a consistency suggesting it was the universal background texture of the attack run, you were hit, and the question was whether what was hit was something you could continue without. The rear seat man's experience of the dive bombing attack was structurally different from the pilot's, and this difference captures something essential about what the Dauntless asked of the two men who flew it together. The rear seat radio man gunner sat facing aft, and when the pilot rolled into the dive, the rear seat man's physical orientation was inverted relative to the pilot's. His head was toward the target, his feet were toward the sky, and the G- forces of the dive acted on him in a direction the human vestibular system processes differently than the pilot's orientation. The dive the pilot experienced as a controlled descent toward a visible target was experienced by the rear seat man as a high-speed approach to ground he could not see, from a position that gave him a view of the sky where fighters were likely to appear. He was then required to man the twin 30- caliber guns on the flexible mount and engage any Japanese fighter that attacked from the rear quadrant during the attack run. This required him to maintain situational awareness of an air combat environment while inverted in a 70-degree dive at 270-5 miles per hour with anti-aircraft fire going off around the aircraft. The 30- caliber ammunition the rear gun carried was inadequate for this task against a Zero, and this was known undocumented in the action reports from the first months of Pacific combat. A 30- caliber round impacting a Zero's airframe did not produce the same structural damage that the Zero's 20- can unproduced against the Dauntless, and the asymmetry was not subtle. The Zero's cannon round entering the Dauntless's fuselage couldn't regularly did cause casualties to the rear seat man and the pilot, ignite the fuel system, destroy the engine, or sever the control surfaces. The Dauntless's 30- caliber round entering the Zero's airframe required precise placement in the engine or the pilot to produce equivalent results, and the rear seat men knew this arithmetic and flew their missions with it as a background condition of the job. The numbers that defined what Dauntless crews actually experienced deserve their concentrated passage here because they establish the gap between the precision instrument narrative and the operational reality with a specificity no description of individual experience can provide alone. The SBD was the Navy's primary carrier-based bomber from 1940 until mid-1940-4, when the Curtiss SB-2 Held Iver began replacing it despite the Held Diver's own extensive operational problems. During those 4 years of primary service, Dauntless squadrons flew from every American carrier that operated in the Pacific, from land bases in the Solomon Islands, from the Coral Sea to the waters off Japan's home islands. The Navy and Marine Corps together operated approximately 5,900 SBDs during the war, and of these, 1,180-9 were lost to all causes combat, operational accident, carrier landing accidents, weather, and mechanical failure. That loss rate of roughly 20% across the production run does not capture the concentration of loss in the combat carrier squadrons, which saw individual squadron attrition rates in sustained combat significantly higher than the fleet average. Scouting Squadron 6, flying from USS Enterprise at Midway, launched 18 aircraft in the June 4th attack on the Japanese carrier force, and of those 18, 14 survived to recover aboard Enterprise or at Midway, but did not return, and of the 14 that returned, several were damaged, several had wounded crew members, and at least 2 had rear seat gunners who had fired their .30- calibers to the last round against attacking Zeros during the withdrawal. For aircraft lost from 18 launched represents a 20-2% loss rate in a single strike, and by any measurement of acceptable attrition in sustained operations, 20-2% per strike is not sustainable. In the context of Midway, where the 4 Japanese carriers that were sunk justified every cost the attack produced, the loss rate was transformed into victory by the outcome. The men who did not return were not available to assess the outcome, as they were in the water north of Midway, or in their aircraft on the bottom of the Pacific, or at a position listed in the squadron's action report, as last observed going down trailing smoke. The water was always a specific concern with specific mathematics for Dauntless crews, as a carrier-based aircraft operating 150 to 200 miles from the carrier at combat speeds had enough fuel for the outbound leg, the attack, and the return, if the return was direct and the outbound position was accurately known. The fuel margin was not generous, and for pilots returning from a strike with battle damage that had reduced engine efficiency, with a fuel system that may have taken rounds during the attack, navigating back to a carrier whose position had changed from the launch point, the fuel margin was sometimes not there at all. The phenomenon the Pacific carrier war produced and became one of its signatures was the lost returning strike aircraft, where the carrier that had launched the strike moved and the pilot navigating back to the launch position found empty ocean. He searched in the direction he believed the carrier had moved. His fuel ran out, and he ditched while the rear seat man transmitted a position as long as the radio worked. A rescue aircraft or a destroyer might find them or might not, depending on how far from the search pattern the current had moved the raft by the time the search arrived. This happened throughout the Dauntless's operational life, and it happened at Midway in the navigation errors that sent Lieutenant Commander John Waldron's Torpedo Squad Renate into the Japanese Combat Air Patrol without fighter escort. A navigation failure so tragic in its consequences that it tends to overshadow the fact that the Dauntless squadrons, also navigating under stress to targets whose precise position was estimated rather than known, also experienced navigation failure. At Midway, Lieutenant Commander Clarence McClu Sky's IVE bomber group from Enterprise spent 40 minutes past the expected contact point searching for the Japanese fleet before finding them, and those 40 minutes consumed fuel. The pilots who found the Fleetendove on Kaga and Akagian so are why you were already committed to a fuel margin that had no room for error on the return, and some of them made it back while others ditched. The ones who ditched spent time in the water north of Midway while the battle they had just decided continued around them, and the specific incident that reaches into the center of what Dauntless service actually required is not Midway because Midway has been told. It is the campaign that came before Midway that prepared the men who flew Midway the grinding attrition sustained carrier operations around Guadalcanal in the second half of 1940-2. When the Dauntless was flown by men who had not yet become the mythologized figures the Midway narrative would eventually produce, against an enemy that was still capable of destroying American carriers, in conditions that tested the physical as psychological limits of what sustained combat aviation demanded. Between August and November 1940-2, the waters around Guadalcanal consumed two American carriers was sunk by submarine torpedo by September 15th, and Hornet sunk at the Battle of Santa Cruz on October 20-6th. A third, Enterprise, was badly damaged at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August and at Santa Cruz in October, and the Dauntless squadrons aboard these carriers flew strike after strike against Japanese naval forces trying to reinforce the Guadalcanal garrison. They flew from carriers whose fighter escort was frequently inadequate for the threat environment against Japanese fleet units whose anti-mine aircraft defense was improving with each engagement as the Japanese studied the American attack patterns. The pilots who flew these missions in the fall of 1940- were not fresh graduates of the training command, but men who had been in combat since early in the year, who had flown at Midway or Coral Sea or both, who had watched their squadrons absorb losses and receive replacements who were then lost and replaced again, and the accumulated experience was both the force's greatest asset and its greatest vulnerability. Because the losses were consuming the cohort that could not be quickly replaced, and the physical demands of sustained carrier operations in this period add another dimension the Midway narrative's dramatic compression tends to obscure. A Dauntless pilot in a carrier squadron at Guadalcanal in September 1940- was flying missions that launched before dawn and recovered after dark with multiple sorties per day during intense periods of fleet action. Between sorties, the pilot briefed the next mission, ate if there was time, and tried to sleep in the ready room in the intervals between launch and rig of recycles. The ready room aboard a carrier in 1940- was not a rest facility but a workspace with seats that could be leaned back marginally, with the noise of the carrier's operations transmitted through the ship's structure into the ship's structure into the space where the pilot sat. The ready room temperature in the tropics was comparable to the berthing spaces between 80-5 and 100 degrees Fahrenheit, with whatever air the ventilation system moved through it. The SBD's oxygen system was a standard military dilute or minus demand type that provided supplemental oxygen at altitudes above 10,000 feet, but its reliability under combat conditions and sustained operational use fell below the design standard. Ice formation in the delivery lines at high altitude blocked flow, and connector fittings on the mask seals deteriorated with repeated use and the moisture cycles of tropical operations. Pilots flew in this condition, partially rested at best, managing the accumulated physiological stress of multiple combat sorties, fed when circumstances permitted rather than on any schedule. Processing the specific psychological experience of watching squadron mates not return and then being called to brief for the next mission, while the oxygen system on the Dauntless produced operational casualties, categorized separately but experienced as part of the same continuous hazard. Pilots flying at 15,000 to 17,000 feet with an oxygen system delivering less than the required flow were hypoxics, and hypoxia at those altitudes produces a specific cognitive state the aviation medicine literature described with clinical precision. One of hypoxia's defining characteristics is that it impairs the judgment required to assess that judgment is impaired, and a pilot at 15,000 feet with an oxygen system delivering half the required flow would notice nothing wrong. He would continue to fly the aircraft, make navigation decisions, assess tactical situations, and target his bomb, all with cognitive function reduced by a margin the physiology textbooks quantified and the operational briefings could not reliably prevent. The tactical learning curve the Dauntless's combat experience drove across the war was steep, and its lessons were paid for in the specific currency tactical learning always costs. The Zero was faster than the Dauntless, more maneuverable than the Dauntless, carried heavier armament than the Dauntless's rear defense, and was flown by men who had spent years developing the tactical instincts required to use those advantages. The intercepts at Coral Sea and Midway and the Guadalcanal campaign produced data about what worked and what did not work in penetrating a Japanese combat air patrol with a dive bomber attack, and that data was written in the language of which aircraft came home and which did not. What emerged from this process by mid-1940- 3 was a tactical framework that used the Dauntless's precision as the term and an instrument of a carefully coordinated attack package. This coordination was the product of 18 months of combat experience, doctrinal revision, and the specific calibration that only happens when the feedback from what went wrong is immediate, final, and recorded in the action reports as the names of men who did not return. The men who died producing the calibration were not making mistakes in any useful sense of the term, as they were doing exactly what they had been trained to do, against an enemy that was simultaneously learning what they had been trained to do. The psychological cost of sustained dive bombing operations was documented in the Naval Aviation Psychology Studies of 1940-, for in terms the operational squadrons commanding officers would have recognized from observation. The specific form combat stress took in dive bomber pilots was shaped by the attack geometry itself, the committed dive, the inability to maneuver once the dive brakes were deployed, the 30 seconds of exposure during which all evasive options were foreclosed by the requirement to hold the aim. Fighter pilots under attack could maneuver, could reverse, could extend, could use speed and altitude to change the tactical geometry, but dive bomber pilots in the terminal phase of an attack could do none of these things. They could hold the dive and complete the release, or they could abort the dive and survive the mission without delivering the bomb, and the institutional and psychological pressures that shaped this choice were not addressed in any official doctrine. The doctrine assumed the pilot would hold the dive, and the question of what holding the dive in the face of accurate tanty- aircraft fire into zero, making a gunnery run on the fuselage from behind actually required of the man performing, it was left to the man to resolve privately and immediately. Most of them held the dive, and the ones who held the dive and were hit during it either completed the release and then managed whatever damage the aircraft had sustained, or they did not complete the release because the damage was sufficient to prevent it. Or they completed the release and then did not recover from the dive because the damage was sufficient to prevent recovery, and the action reports record these outcomes in the category of aircraft failing to recover from the attack dive, which is accurate but does not convey what it looked like from the other aircraft in the formation. The Marine Corps squadrons that flew Dauntless from land bases on Guadalcanal through the fall of 1940- to and into 1940-3 operated under conditions that combined the combat demands of carrier-based operations with the specific additional miseries of the island environment. That made carrier service, for all its limitations, something the land-based squadrons would have traded for, as Henderson Field on Guadalcanal was operational from August 1940- to onward, having been seized from the Japanese and immediately put into service by the Marines who landed on August 7th. The field's operational conditions for the first 3 months of its use were determined by the competing pressures of Japanese artillery shelling, Japanese air attack, malaria, dysentery, tropical rainfall, inadequate food supply, and the mechanical stress on aircraft operating from a pierced steel planking runway. That imposed loads on landing gear the Dauntless's designers had not specified the aircraft tolerate, and aircraft that landed hard on Henderson and the pierced steel planking produced a landing surface that made hard landings more frequent than the carrier deck did. They experienced landing gear failures, tire damage, and structural stress that shortened maintenance intervals and accelerated the deterioration of aircraft that were already operating in a maintenance environment with inadequate tools and mechanics who were themselves subject to malaria and dysentery. It rates the medical records of the period document with a clinical precision that conveys how systematic the problem was, and the men of SBD received, in recognition of their operations during this period, the Presidential Unit Citation. The citation described their operations in terms that tactical significance of what they had accomplished interdicting Japanese supply runs, protecting the Marine garrison, contributing to the survival of the Guadalcanal beachhead, and it described these operations accurately. It did not describe what the operations felt like from inside an SBD with a misfiring engine and a rear seat gunner, managing a fever of 103 degrees on a mission against a Japanese destroyer that was shooting back. What the Dauntless crews brought home from the war Those who came home were structured by what they had spent the war doing in a specific and documented way, and the cumulative effects of sustained high-G flight showed up in the post-war health histories of Dauntless veterans. The pullout from a Dauntless dives at release altitude produced G- forces between 5 and 7 G, depending on the pilot's pullback rate and the airspeed at release, and hearing loss from the engine and from the aerodynamic noise of the dive was universal. At 6 G, the apparent weight of a 170-pound pilot becomes 1,020 pounds, concentrated in the spinal column and the interorbital discs through the compression of the seated position. A pilot performing 3 or 4 attack dives or missions over a year or 2 of combat operations accumulated a spinal loading history that expressed itself in the post-war years as chronic back pain, disc degeneration, and the specific orthopedic condition the VA processed as routine. Most of them did not describe in any public or recorded way what the dive had been like in specific terms, as the specific interior experience of the committed dive was not something the vocabulary of post-war civilian life provided adequate terms for. What it felt like to hold the sight on a carrier deck rowing in the windscreen, while the anti-aircraft bursts walked across the formation and the rear seat man was calling a 0 on the 6 and the bomb release was still 4 seconds away. And most of them did not try, but one of them did, briefly once, as Aviation radio man 2nd Class Eugene Fairbanks of Portland, Oregon, was 20-2 years old when he reported to Scouting Squadron 6 at Pearl Harbor in January 1940-2. Assigned as rear seat gunner in an SBD-3, he flew at Midway on June 4, 1940-2, in the aircraft piloted by Lieutenant Walter Rode, and he flew at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August. He flew 11 missions from Henderson Field during the Guadalcanal campaign in September and October before VS-6 was withdrawn to Pearl Harbor for reconstitution. In a letter to his sister in Portland written from Pearl Harbor in November 1940-2, 3 months after Midway, 6 weeks after his last Henderson Field mission, Fairbanks attempted to describe what the dive was like. The letter was preserved by his family and donated to the Oregon Historical Society in 1970-8, and the relevant passage reads in its entirety as follows. You roll in, and the world goes sideways, and then the nose comes down, and the target is there, and there is nothing to do but hold it and keep holding it, and the guns from the ships below are going, and the man behind you is trying to do his job. And you are trying to do yours, and the whole thing lasts about half a minute, and then either you pull out or you don't, and then you do it again another day. He said he did not know how to describe it any better than that, and he said he was not sure it could be described, and Fairbanks returned to Portland after the war. He worked for 30-8 years as a postal carrier on a route in the Alameda neighborhood, walking the same streets in the same sequence for nearly 4 decades. His daughter, in a brief account she wrote for a family history project in 2001, described asking him once whether he missed flying. He said he did not miss the flying, and he said he missed the men he had flown with, which he understood was a different thing, and that the distinction between those 2 forms of missing was something he had spent a long time working out. He died in 2003 at the age of 80-3, having outlived most of the men he had flown with, and he had attended the VS-6 reunions. Every year they were held from 1940-7 until the reunion stopped in the late 1990s. Because there were no longer enough men left to hold one, and the last reunion was attended by 4 men, and Fairbanks was among them, while the others are not named in the account his daughter wrote. What they talked about, she did not record, and she said she had not been there, but she said her father came home from that last reunion quieter than usual, which she had not thought was possible, and that he sat in the backyard that evening for a long time until after dark, and that when she went out to check on him, he was fine, and she should not worry, and he would be in soon. He came in soon, and that is where the written record ends with an elderly man who once sat with a dive bomber watching fighters approach from the direction he could not fly away from, now sitting in his backyard watching the stars appear over Portland. If you want more stories about the forgotten cost behind history's greatest battles, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. I am your aviation historian, and I will see you in the next story from the skies.